So here we are, summer's end, and our last video.
Don't rub it in. Anyway, we are here today to teach you about the years 1 CE to 1200 CE, which is the starting point of AP World Modern.
But first, a recap of our videos so far, so you don't miss one. First, we talked about the AP World Regions map.
Then we looked at world history from the time humanity became a thing all the way up to 1 CE.
Then world religions.
Which brings us to now. We'll be going in a circle today, starting in Europe, starting in Europe and working our way around Afro-Eurasia and into a tiny bit of Oceania. As we mentioned in our last global survey, the Americas will get their own catch-up time later in the actual course itself. For now, Europe.
When we last left Europe, much of it was under control of the Roman Republic/Empire, whose history we can only really highlight here. So here goes. The Republic started small, but grew to take over its neighbors, then its neighbors' neighbors, and so on, until it eventually controlled the entirety of the Mediterranean coast and a good chunk of Western Europe too.
We don't really have time here to break down the political history of the Romans, but you need to know that they never quite got the whole succession thing down. So every so often an emperor would die without a clear heir or a named heir, usually due to murder-related reasons.
You know what I did the other day? What? I Googled murder.
You Googled murder?
And then there would be a series of civil wars, and then everything would be peaceful again, and the cycle would continue. Those civil wars tended to be really bad for the health of an empire, like civil wars usually are, and a particularly long series of them nearly sank the Roman state in the 200s, CE, of course. Eventually, one emperor decided to cut the empire into two pieces and thus make it easier to manage. A little bit after that, in 312, Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, which is a huge deal because it completely altered the course of European religious history.
Like we said in our last video, the Romans had outlawed Christianity and made it into an underground faith. Constantine's conversion made public Christianity okay, but over the course of 300 years, isolated Christian communities had come to believe many different things, and Constantine did his best to organize the religion's beliefs through a series of church councils. In the end, the Roman-based version of Christianity became the foundation of the Catholic Church, which began to try to convert all of Europe to itself, seeking to convert or root out non-Christians and non-Catholic Christians wherever they could find them, which is really intense if you think about it.
Away from religious matters and back to politics.
Ew.
After Constantine's death, the Romans resumed their patterns of civil wars, and frankly, the old Western Empire couldn't take it. Weakened within by turmoil and invaded from without by Germanic tribes and a group called the Huns, who were probably from Central Asia, the Western Empire just couldn't stay standing, and by the 470s, 480s CE, it was gone, replaced with a series of kingdoms which were smaller and weaker and often less well organized than the old Roman Empire.
But Eastern Rome, which was wealthier, more urban, and better defended, was still doing okay. Around this time, historians start to call the Eastern Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire. You'll probably want to call it the Byzantine, and that's wrong, which actually lasted until 1453. The Byzantines had their own church, Eastern Orthodoxy, and they were more of a hybrid of Greek and Roman culture than purely Roman. They built massive buildings. Their capital of Constantinople was one of Earth's largest cities for hundreds of years, and they did their best to carry on the legacy of Rome for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire.
And we will talk more about the Byzantines in our class. For Western Europe, though, the fall of the Roman Empire represented a downgrade in the quality of life, but it wasn't the mass societal collapse that everybody likes to think that it was. Reading and writing did become less frequent, and church power certainly increased, but it wasn't the famous plague and filth-encrusted Dark Age that you may have heard about. A downgrade is not the same thing as a societal collapse. Now, to be fair, though, life in post-Roman Europe, which we'll look at more in September, was nowhere near as cool as life in our next location, Dar al-Islam, the Islamic world.
After Muhammad died in 632, his successors, Caliph in Arabic, continued the expansion of the Islamic world through a combination of missionary work and conquest. The United Arabs turned out to be really good at conquest too. And by the mid-700s, the Islamic world, which had started in one city, looked like this.
And while it's impressive on a map, it is important to note that caliphs or caliphs, especially the later ones, didn't hold too much power on the fringes of this Islamic empire. Local rulers handled that. A lot like Rome earlier in this video, we don't have time to go into the incredibly complex politics of the Islamic world, but just know that by 1200, this theoretically united faith had fractured into different sects, based on ethnicity. Apparently, this is Daffy Duck presents the Islamic world. You just need to know that by 1200, this faith, which was theoretically united, was in fact divided into several different sects based on both ethnicity and on the succession after Muhammad. The most notable division within Islam, then and now, is the split between the Sunni and Shia branches of the faith. That started as a succession debate right after Muhammad's death, but it became deeper and deeper and deeper as the years went on. We actually get to look at that a couple of times in our course, and it's really interesting, but for now, we got to move on.
And even though the faith had fractured, life in the Islamic world up to the 1200s would have been extremely nice. Bathing was a much more common practice, literacy was encouraged, to read the Quran, but also for all the other perks reading brings. By the 1200s, the world's largest library was in Baghdad, Iraq. Excellent engineers managed elaborate water systems for desert towns. Architects built gorgeous mosques everywhere from Spain to Iran. Traders brought back spices and other goods, which brought both wealth and luxury to the Islamic world.
And life was even good for non-Muslims in the Islamic world. Yeah, they had to pay a tax and were usually excluded from political life, but compared to being burned alive, which was the punishment for non-Catholics in Western Europe at this time, paying higher taxes isn't all that bad. Here, I'll prove it to you. Hey, is being burned alive worse than paying higher taxes?
Yep.
See? Non-Muslims could also become physicians and traders, and they stood to profit from the connections and wealth present in the Muslim world. Honestly, by 1200, about the only thing that could ruin life in the Islamic world would be if a horde of murderous wanderers showed up to destroy the major cities and massacre people indiscriminately. But that's not a lesson we're going to cover in early September or anything like that.
All right, moving on. In Africa at this time, we begin to see state building, not just in the Islamic North, but also in sub-Saharan Africa. In West Africa, the Ghana Empire formed, with its economy based on the incredibly profitable salt for gold trade across the Sahara Desert. Jot that trade down. It will be important for later West African empires.
In East Africa, the Aksumite Empire formed in and around what is the modern nation of Ethiopia, trading East African goods like ivory with Rome and the Byzantines, and adopting Christianity from those empires. Further south, along Africa's east coast, we see the Swahili people, who form a series of city-states participating in trade across the Indian Ocean with Arabs and others, including as far away as China, and adopting Islam. We'll see those guys later too. Inland from them is one of the more mysterious places in our course, the great city of Great Zimbabwe, which features huge walls and was probably the source of East Africa's gold, but they never developed a writing system, so everything about them is a guess. History is fun.
Crossing the Indian Ocean to India, we arrive at a place whose political history is impossible to summarize in a short video. Between 1 CE and 1200 CE, India saw multiple empires and states unified chunks of the continent without ever coming all that close to taking the whole thing. The largest of these states was the Gupta Empire, which ruled all of this territory from the 300s to the 500s CE.
But keep in mind, political disunity doesn't make a place unimportant, and India is no exception. Spices, especially pepper from India, were in high demand throughout Afro-Eurasia, and Indian cities, states, and empires made plenty of money from their neighbors during this time. Also, Hinduism pretty firmly entrenched itself as the main religion of India during this time, thanks to a combination of strong support from Hindu states. Rulers would enforce that as an official state religion, and Hinduism's ability to absorb the more popular aspects of faiths like Buddhism and Jainism.
Southeast Asia in 1200 was confusing. We actually get to look at a lot of this in class, so what you need to know right now is this. The prominent kingdoms of Southeast Asia were two things: Buddhist and based on trade. We'll look more at some of them very soon, but for now, just write those things down.
This brings us to our final large area of the class, China. We last left China under the rule of the Han Dynasty, which would eventually collapse due to internal corruption and external invasion. Tell me if that sounds familiar. Unlike Rome, however, China split, more or less, into three warring kingdoms for a while, and then entered a time period of jaw-droppingly complex political turmoil. Only thing you need to know from this time period is this is when Buddhism really began to take root in China. To save your brains, we're not going to dwell on that time frame. We're just going to skip ahead to reunification, which Mr. Simpson is going to tell you about.
Europe never reunified after the collapse of Western Rome, but China was reunified a number of times. The first one to really stick was the Sui dynasty, who put the country back together in 589. And that was their big contribution. The Sui fell apart soon after and were replaced by the Tang dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 907 CE. After their collapse, northern China was controlled by foreign powers, while southern China had another ethnically Chinese dynasty, the Sung, who lasted from 960 to 1279.
Tang and Sung China are often viewed as the golden age of China. They refined earlier traditions of the Han and kind of squeezed Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism together into a system called Neo-Confucianism, and they heavily promoted the arts. They also oversaw a massive population boom, which was facilitated by a new type of rice from Vietnam, and the nation went from a population of 60 million in the 800s to 120 million by 1200. And while Tang and Sung China are often taught hand in hand in history class, they did have one very important difference, namely how they treated women.
Women in Tang Dynasty China were treated pretty well, especially compared to how women were typically treated in settled societies throughout the world at the time. Tang China even had an empress for a few years. The Song, however, were much more patriarchal, practicing foot binding, where young girls' feet were intentionally crushed to create a small, delicate foot, which was deemed attractive at the time. While all societies at the time were very patriarchal, foot binding was a uniquely Chinese form of patriarchy, which we'll visit later in our course.
There's a few other odds and ends to cover, but I think I can handle them all at once. By 1200, Japan was a series of clans united under a military dictator called a shogun, with a puppet emperor to keep up appearances. Central Asia was mostly nomadic tribes who spent their time fighting each other and the settled societies around them, but who could be a real threat if somebody unified them. The islands of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific were inhabited almost exclusively by hunter-gatherers who were in the very, very early stages of state building and of settling down at that point. And as we mentioned way back at the start of this video, when we were all so much younger, the Americas will get caught up with about a month into our course.
Was it overly dramatic? So yeah, there we are. We're ready to go. We're in the 1200s.
Yep, the stage is set for our course, the gigantic, bloody, horrible chess game of history.
I prefer Chinese checkers.
Delightful.
Sorry.
Where did you even come from? We'll see you soon. Thank you for watching. Bye.
Bye. First, a recap of our videos so far. Dang it. It's not video, it's videos.
Oh, videos. Anyway, all right.
Start
again.
A number of times. The first one to really... Blah, just say it.
Sorry, I'm not good at writing. Tang Dynasty.
Oh, we're recording.
Oh, that's fine. I was making fun of you saying Tang Dynasty. Hi, Nasi.
We are right now. Hey, look, everybody, it's Jamie Nasick. Boop, boop, boop.
Have you used the new copy?
Yeah.
It took me 45 minutes to make these
Slow as
copies.
death. Yeah.
Slow.
Incredibly
Oh my god.
Jaw dropping
Bye.
slow. See ya. New copiers as slow as an App State student.
Ooh, it's funny because she went to App State.
Yeah, they know. They got it. Are we still filming?
We are. Women in Tong.
There's nothing funny there.
I said tongue in my mind anyway.
Tong.
I know. All right, let's redo it.
Yeah, we're still rolling.
Women in Tong. All right.
Straight faces. Serious face. Tang Dynasty.
Not tongue.